On today's episode of the Going Commando podcast, we break down the first preseason game and the debut of number 2 overall pick Jayden Daniels, as well as talk about the current state of the roster, the depth chart, what we're looking forward to for the rest of the preseason, and we finish up with an awesome trivia game. So stick around and stay tuned. Let's get this show started. Welcome to Going Commando, a Washington Commanders podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another episode of the Going Commando podcast, our first, I guess you would say, official episode of the 2024 season as we are after the initial preseason game. It was a 20-17 loss to the New York Jets at MetLife. And we have a lot to talk about from this game, not only what went on in the game, stuff we saw from newcomers, returning guys in new roles. And of course, there's been several personnel changes that have taken place as well since we've last spoken. So thank you all for tuning in. And as always, I'm joined by Chris and Tom. And why don't we just start with the elephant in the room? The offense, and particularly that first team offense we saw in this game, of course, led by Jayden Daniels in his first drive as a Washington Commander.
Yeah, and there's really a lot to say about that first drive. Jayden Daniels is a player who I think came in with a lot of expectations and a lot of question marks too coming into this game. And I know all of us were glued to the screen watching him play against this Jets team this defense, we heard about it when they had a joint practice before the game, shutting down the offense. Jayden Daniels maybe even having a bit of a rough time against that first team defense for the Jets. And I got to be honest, guys, I was pretty happy with what I saw. I mean, he's a young guy. He comes in, he throws one over Austin Eckler's head, and he comes back to the huddle. He calms himself down, and he leads this team to a touchdown scoring drive using his feet, which is something that we haven't necessarily seen from a quarterback since, dare I say, RG3. I was very happy with how he played in that one drive. Obviously, we're talking about a very, very limited sample size here, folks. But he had some great pass completions. He checked it down to the guy that he needed to on the plays where he seemed to be a bit more pressured. And then we, of course, had to talk about that 42-yard bomb, which was his first completion as a Commanders QB in preseason. An absolute beauty of a throw, and I'm sure you guys got to be happy about him as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was pleased with everything I saw. I mean, obviously, started off with the one pass over Eckler's head. He was definitely just getting the jitters out there. I think after that, he was pretty flawless. Again, you kind of mentioned the really nice pass to Diami. Good to see Diami get some action there as well, and clear that he's in the mix with that first team. It was just really great to see. I thought he looked good in the pocket. He wasn't afraid to make. I know it was only a very limited sample size, but wasn't afraid to make that adjustment and make that pass. So yeah, I'm very pleased with what I saw. Obviously, they took him out just after the first drive, which I'm not surprised there. But overall, Jayden, very pleased with what we've seen so far. Just hope we can continue to build on that. Is really what I'm hoping for there.
And I thought we were running the ball pretty well on that drive. Limited action out of Eckler, but there was a few nice B-Rob runs, between the tackles, up the gut. And with Daniels scoring on that drive, we were able to establish a run. Defender fakes on the read option. Daniels an easy score from the goal line off that play. That's an element to this offense I'm really excited to see. You know, his threat of running, how much is that going to open up other lanes for our other running backs? And, you know, again, Eckler, we didn't get to see much of him on that first drive, but he's going to bring an element to this game to complement Brian Robinson very well. And of course, Daniel's giving you an option with his legs as well. So that's something I'm looking forward to seeing more of But yeah, you guys kind of nailed it in the coffin. You know, limited sample size, only one drive, but I know Commanders fans nationwide, were jumping for joy when they saw that ball fall perfectly in the breadbasket, right to De'Ami Brown.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you did hear after that game, coming from both Jayden himself and Dan Quinn talking about that play after the game, was that that wasn't the original call. Jayden Daniels has been working with Cliff Kingsbury, a guy that's been sort of a quarterback guru over the years. And, he saw something he didn't like and he apparently checked it, which is something that you do not do as a rookie quarterback, because it's somewhat, there's a lot to do with the relationship between a quarterback and the play calling coach. And when you're a young guy and you're making those sort of changes at the line, it's always going to be a little bit abrasive unless it works out, because then everyone's happy. And I'll tell you what, man, he made everyone happy with that throw. Absolutely lit up social media with that post. It's nice to see the Commanders getting a bit of love online again after a few not so solid years of being loved. So, I mean, listen, that was a big moment for him. The leadership that it takes to really do that sort of thing, and sort of ask for forgiveness more than permission. I was really happy with that. And Clark, once again, you nailed it. That ground game is important, and he is an important addition to that. You might see us doing a little bit more with him on his feet. Obviously, there was a little bit of criticisms of him in college when he would sort of, maybe not slide as much as he needs to, maybe take a few unnecessary hits. So that might be something that scares us away from that in the regular season. But I mean, I could not be more happy with the way this ground game looked on that first drive, and I certainly believe that Jayden Daniels might be a player to watch when we talk about this offensive rookie of the year talk later down the line.
That would be very exciting. I would agree on that. I would love to see that. I agree, Clark. You mentioned B Rob running hard. That really stood out to me. I was like, wow. I can almost, not that I forgot about B Rob, but he's just going to be. People forget that how much of a integral part of this offense he's going to be, and how he's going to really we're going to establish that hard kind of power run with him. So I was really pleased to see that. We didn't see much of Eckler, like you mentioned, but in just watching interviews with him, since during training camp, and just, from what I've been hearing and also seeing in terms of practice, I agree. He's going to be a really nice compliment in that backfield. Beyond that, it's really a toss up. Again, you saw a lot of different backs in this game. Jeremy McNichols, for a while, he was actually the first back to come off the bench after the first team sat. You also saw some C-Rod, Chris Rodriguez, as well as Mike Wiley, fairly early on in the game, within the first half. And so I would say that third spot is probably between those three guys. I would say it's pretty much a toss up at this point. I would say, actually, if anyone has a disadvantage here, it's actually Chris Rodriguez, because he's a Ron guy. He doesn't have any ties to this organization, and I would say he's the less dynamic, of the three backs. So we'll see what happens there. Not sure if y'all have any thoughts on that. Another guy I'd like to definitely want to talk about is Ben Sinnott. I thought he had some really nice catches with some really good yards after catch. You love to see that, and we really haven't had, I feel like, a guy that can do that on a consistent level for us. So just seeing that is really encouraging as well. I'd like to point out.
I completely agree. And he was a pick that when we made it, I was super excited, and hearing Adam Peters talk to him in the same breath of a use check or a Kittle. I mean, that was super exciting when we drafted the guy, and we got to see some flashes. Of course, he had that one big gain over the middle in which he, looked excellent after the run. And to add on to that tight end room, John Bates made some great plays as a blocker to complement Sinnott. I mean, he's never been, wheels guy, run after the catch, big pass catcher. But I'll tell you what, if Sinnott is what we think he can be, John Bates is a perfect tight end too, to be a guy that we can put in on these heavy run packages, maybe catch a pass at the goal line or something like that. And I thought he made some great plays in the run game.
Absolutely, and this is a room that we've kind of dogged for a while. At least, certainly myself. I truly believe that this is maybe one of the weakest tight end rooms in the league still. But Ben Sinnott really looked like a shining spot of this offense, especially early on in this game. Making a lot of big catches, making guys, sort of shed off him a lot quicker than I think we would expect a rookie tight end too. Ben Sinnott really created a lot more separation than I think you expect a young guy to do, especially in the NFL. I mean, it's not too easy, and obviously this is a preseason game, so maybe he's not running against the first team defense, but he's still running against NFL level guys, and he was able to create that separation. And Clark, I completely agree with you. John Bates is a guy who we haven't necessarily been the kindest to it in past episodes, and I think it's a virtue of how he does play. He is a great blocking tight end. He made a lot of amazing plays as a blocker in this run game, and I think that's something that we can look forward to. And maybe it goes a little bit of that same way with the running backs room and the tight ends room, where we might see both Bates and Sinnott come out in different, sort of offenses. Senna and Eckler being the receiving backs, and maybe you see Bates and Robinson come out for more running plays. Now that would be a little bit difficult for the quick transitions that might have to happen during the play clock, and we'll see how that necessarily works down the line. But I was very proud to see Ben Sinnott, sort of go off and have a lot of amazing catches. And I do want to make one last shout out to that running back room. I think Michael Wiley, for a young guy coming into a very crowded room, into a situation where you are definitely not going to be number one or number two because of the talent ahead of you. You made a statement by being the only other guy to score a rushing touchdown in that game, besides, of course, the aforementioned Jayden Daniels. So I really got to give a big up to Michael Wiley. He had a great game. Um, but this tight end room, man, I mean, things might be turning around, whether it's in the immediate or in the distant future. There's a lot of hope to be seen in that room.
Yeah, I actually like Michael Wiley as well, and I'm team Wiley to kind of take up that third spot at this point. I would say, or not. I wouldn't say that's a firm stance, but based on what I've seen so far, I would love. I think that would be a potential addition that we could consider. Um, Regarding the tight end room, I agree. I think we're forgetting about Zach Ertz. I think he's also going to be a significant part of this offense. I mean, I think they brought him here not only to mentor the younger guys and kind of be that veteran in the room that they kind of really, I feel like, needed, and we're lacking a bit maybe with Logan Thomas, like having a more accomplished veteran in the room. Um, I think that he will, if healthy, granted, you will see him in this offense as well. I think that's again just going to give Ben Sinnott room to grow without having too much pressure on him. And then of course Bates as that other tight end, primarily blocking, but the occasional catch here and there. Curious, really, if they keep a fourth. I think a lot of that depends on talent at other positions and what they value. So yeah, I think that's up in the air. Not even sure who they would keep necessarily with that fourth tight end position. There's a couple names you could throw out there. Cole Turner, no longer Armani Rogers, but there's Colson Yankoff, another guy that maybe could, they don't want to expose to the league, but definitely those top three aforementioned that will be on this team, no doubt. And then with regarding the other offensive position left, I would say receiver. Obviously, had that nice catch we mentioned earlier to Diami. I think he had 2 catches on the day total. So good to see Diami still, playing at a high level. I know people have questions every year about Diami just because he doesn't see the field all that often, or hasn't yet. But who knows? We could see an uptick in him this year. With the departure of say Curtis Samuel, right? Maybe Diami takes a bigger role for us than we expected. Also, Terry had a catch. He exited the game very quickly, as you would expect. Jahan, I believe he had maybe a catch or two. I don't remember exactly, but he was in the mix as well. Didn't really see Luke McCaffrey, in my opinion, until late in the game. So that, I don't know what that tells me. If he's, just still behind in terms of development, or if they don't, just how big of a part is he going to have in this offense this year. I think you will see him. He's definitely making this team. I just, not sure if he'll be running with that first team or not when it's all said and done. Curious on that. And then also, you kind of have the back end of that receiver room, right? Who makes those last spot or two that are left? I think you saw a lot of Olamide Zaccheaus. I'm not sure if you guys would agree on that as well. Saw a lot of Olamide Zaccheaus this game, especially in the first half with those first teams. So I think that they call him OZ apparently. So I think that OZ is going to be on this team as well. So not even sure if that leaves one final spot or not. I think it does because whoever's going to hold down kicking and punt return opportunities, which I'm sure we'll speak to later, probably locks up that last spot. But interested to hear y'all's thoughts. I know I just kind of laid out the receiver room there but curious on what y'all's takes were there.
That was something I was very intrigued to talk about when I saw it come out, that initial depth chart. And one of the biggest kind of things I noticed was OZ being listed as the third receiver over guys like Luke McCaffrey, De'Ami Brown, who we did, of course, see early, and Jamison Crowder. He got in early, but Luke McCaffrey being a little bit behind, that certainly was interesting. And he's been a guy that obviously the media has been heralding as our wide receiver three. But I think the biggest story in my eyes from this game was Jahan Dotson, who really for the first time in his career now is going to have to be the true number two. I mean, we saw he had a solid rookie campaign with Curtis Samuel largely injured, but last season, Kurtco, was healthy the whole year and kind of had, I would say, a bigger role than Jahan in the passing game. But this year, he's kind of going to have to be that number two guy for Jayden. And from what I saw, he bobbled his first catch. I mean, it wasn't that crazy. Some people were getting nuts over it online, but he struggled in the run game. Uh, there was a particular play with Chris Rodriguez hitting the edge that earlier in the game that just Jahan just completely missed his assignment and was not great. There was another play where he lost his footing on a route. I mean, minor things. Of course, it's only one preseason game, but for a guy that we're gonna, be relying on to be our wide receiver too, this is our first round pick. He's gonna need to step up, in my opinion.
I think that's a great point about Jahan. I noticed that as well, that he had struggles. That was called out that he had struggles in the blocking game as well. And that I think this receiver room is a lot more open and fluid than we think. I mean, I think like to your point, that depth chart having OZ, Olamide Zaccheaus, ahead of a lot of guys that we honestly expected to have bigger roles in this offense. I think you also have to again take a look at the back end of that receiver roster. Like who's going to take up that last spot? Jamison Crowder. I didn't see a lot of Jamison Crowder during this game at all. He's I think he's in jeopardy of not making this team. Other guys. I mean, you saw guys like Bryson Tremaine, and other guys that unfortunately definitely most likely than not making this team, right? So really curious and like again, like I said, naturally lends itself to talking about who's going to take up those duties at kick returner, punt returner. It likely will be a receiver, I would imagine. So there's a few names in there. You saw guys like Davion Davis, guy that was not on my radar at all before this game, doing a lot of work back there as well. So yeah, and I would say that pretty much sums up the receiver room. But any final thoughts there before we kind of speak about O-line briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I got a few things to say about this receiver room. Not too many, though. I mean, obviously, that third spot, as you mentioned, Clark and Chris, is a very interesting spot because I think you saw more out of De'Ami Brown this game than you did out of Olamide Zaccheaus, although Zaccheaus was returning kicks. At least one of them I'm quite sure about. So that's going to be an interesting thing because he will be taking over that coveted Dax Milne spot that we saw last year. A guy who we'll talk about maybe a bit later on in the show. But this receiver room, I mean, you got to remember we came into this year, and maybe not even coming into this year, but more sort of as we got closer to preseason, we heard a lot of talks about big names possibly, wanting to join this receiver room, and it didn't necessarily work out. The trade situation being what it was, blah blah blah. Um, But it's definitely a question of, who's that 3 and 4, and maybe even that 5 who you could be seeing on the field switching out. I think if we're going to talk about anyone making the best case for themselves, I think De'Ami Brown, as a guy who's been in this system for, I believe, 3 to 4 years now, that's a guy who, I mean, I've been impressed with for most of the things I've seen him do in the very limited time he has had on the field for this team. So I'm very hopeful for him in terms of, he's probably going to be kept. Now, does he get the playing time that we might expect him to if he ends up being that third guy? I'm not sure, because do have a guy like Luke McCaffrey, who, even though, as you mentioned, Chris, he didn't really flash until late, he still flashed and made a few great catches, got good separation, and even when he didn't, he was able to make his catches. So that's very important. I think a guy also like, Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, a guy who we haven't even necessarily talked about at all outside of maybe being, a UDFA signing. He made a catch as well that was quite impressive, and it might not have been for, 10, 20, 30 yards, but it was still a great catch. So he's a guy that you could maybe expect to see a little bit more out of. But this is a crowded receiver room by the looks of it in the early preseason. It'll be just as interesting to watch this room develop and sort of, become more consolidated as it will be to see that tight end room be consolidated and see, how that sort of goes. Now, obviously, we might have jumped the proverbial barricade a little bit too quick here on this quarterback room, because we did see three other quarterbacks play besides Jayden Daniels, and we saw Marcus Mariota, the guy who we presumptively think is going to be the second quarterback on this depth chart, and then we saw the sort of the battle between Sam Hartman and Jeff Driscoll. And if you didn't watch this game, you'd think that these two guys are pretty similar, at least by the stats, but I was really impressed by sort of the maturity and sort of the pro readiness that Sam Hartman showed during this game. I mean, throwing to the guys and handing off the ball to the guys that we've been talking about previously. I was really impressed by that. Jeff Driscoll is a guy who, he's had a few years in this league. He certainly made his impact on the teams that he's been on, as minor or as major as that may have been at the time that he was on them. But it's curious to see whether or not we will continue to keep a veteran presence like Jeff Driscoll around Jayden Daniels to help Marcus Mariota maybe get Jayden Daniels more ready for the pro level, or whether you'll see a guy like Sam Hartman, we might take a flyer on him and have him really sort of be that young guy to come in with Jayden Daniels, much like a Kirk Cousins, much like, the guys of Commando's past who have come in as a young guy with a guy over them, and really sort of developed into their own player following these superstars. So I'm curious to see how that room shakes out as well. I don't know if you guys have too many notes on this QB room, but I think it's one to watch as we continue through this preseason.
One thing I'll say is that we, of course, saw very limited action from QB1. We saw very limited action from QB2. Most of this game was given to Driscoll and Hartman to kind of battle it out. And in that one drive we saw out of Marcus Mariota, I mean, the stats will show you that he went 1 for 1 for 6 yards, but it was not an impressive drive to say the least. And, talking with Eagles fans in the past, former recurring guest, Brass, talked to me about having Marcus on his team last year, and he was not impressed with what he saw from him in his snaps of the preseason last year. He had a full year to start with Atlanta a couple of years ago, but obviously didn't end very well. And he's a recognizable name, but I'm not convinced that he's a better passer necessarily than the other quarterbacks we have on this roster. Like you mentioned, Tom, Sam Hartman did look pro ready. Absolutely, he looks like a guy that can make some throws. He's not going to wow you with any of his ability, but um, you know, it'll be interesting to see who they go with. They go over a more veteran Driscoll, or give a guy like Hartman a chance to start his NFL career. I really don't know at this point.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Clark, because I completely agree. I actually have concerns about Marcus Mariota as well. And actually, some of them actually came from that. I'm not sure either you watched that quarterback show that was on. I'm
Yep,
not sure exactly when that
Netflix.
came out. Yeah, a year or two ago. I believe Mariota was on the Raiders. Correct me if I'm
I
wrong,
think
but
it was his Falcons year where he was
was
he
it
was playing a
Falcons?
lot. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I remember them just not. I remember him not always being painted in the best light, as necessarily in terms of leadership as well. So I mean, take that with a grain of salt, or take that as you will, right? But that also compared with just like hasn't really put it together, hasn't really put together that great of play. I feel like people like the idea of Marcus Mariota backing up Jayden Daniels, then it actually would be good for us. I actually am in the camp, which I don't know how big this camp is, but that I think Jeff Driscoll is a better quarterback to have at number 2 than Marcus Mariota. I actually thought he looked pretty good for what it's worth. He actually can move a little bit. He even ran with his legs. He's not like stuck in stone. He can move a little bit, and I think he's a decent veteran to have if this is what you're going with in the QB room over Mariota. I think Mariota is honestly just taking up cap space, and because I think if push comes to shove and you have to start Mariota for this team, I don't think that will last very long. If that has to be over a long period of time, I really don't. Sam Hartman, I think, looked good. I still think he might be stashed on the practice squad, but maybe they do keep him on the active roster if he looks really good these next 2 games and they're worried about him getting poached. So, really interesting stuff there with the QB room. I'm glad you guys brought that up. Anyone want to take a stab at what they thought about the O line before we switch to defense, I guess?
I mean, yeah, this is sort of my bread and butter here. I do love the big boys up front. I feel like this was a great game for them. Obviously, you talk about these starters that were in for one drive, and I think you saw a few of the guys actually play a bit more than that. But I mean, my quick notes on this would just be, it was a great game for the offensive line, only allowing 1 sack. Now, obviously, there were some runs that didn't necessarily work out as well as they could have, but that's to be expected in the game of football. Um, that schemes being what they are and players being what they are. You did see some of these guys not necessarily start. Some of the guys who were projected as starters not necessarily play as much this game. But I was very happy with what I saw out of the offensive line. I think that this is a group that has maybe not the best depth in terms of talent, but a lot of depth in terms of size and guys who we can sort of plug and play into these different roles. I think the real test for this offensive line will be these next 2 games when you see the first team offense possibly trotted out there a lot more, and you see them playing a lot more first team defense in terms of snap counts. So, not too much to add to this, but I will say one of the things that I was quite happy with is that we didn't see too many penalties from the offensive line. And that was certainly something that happened a lot last year. I mean, Andrew Wiley is a guy we brought over from the Chiefs. He was obviously very hyped, and he had a kind of a rough year in terms of, allowing a lot of sacks and having some flags thrown for his blocking. So overall, I think that this was a game where, it's great that we don't have to talk about them because they really didn't make much news in terms of being bad or being overly good. Um, so that's my quick notes on that. I'm not sure if Clark, you have anything else to add.
The one thing I am most looking forward to with this offensive line unit and that we didn't get to see was Brandon Coleman. The rookie out of TCU is listed as our starting left tackle at this point in time. He's dealing with an injury at the moment, so he didn't play in that game. I'm hoping we get to see some snaps from him in the preseason because he's listed in the first team over Corn Lucas, a guy that has started, and played a lot of snaps for this team over the course of several years. So, really excited to see what Brandon Coleman can bring, and hopefully we get to see him before week 1.
Agreed on that. And I think this was also just a test of depth for the team, considering we had some starters out. I think a guy like Chris Paul, got some stars here in this game because a guy that usually is playing that guard position for us showed that he can still play some tackle, a position that he played in college at Tulsa. And I think that he was actually out there with the first team at tackle position. So I mean, that's a head nod and vote of confidence for him to maybe be one of these guys in depth that makes that this roster coming out. I mean, I think a couple other guys you saw Mason Brooks playing guard and tackle. You saw guys like Michael Dieter around the interior. You saw some Ricky Strongberg action as well. I think not all those guys are making this team, and so it's going to be interesting to see who shakes out there at the end. You saw Trent Scott at tackle a lot in this game as well. So, because keep in mind, not only was Brandon Coleman out, but also Andrew Wiley and Corn Lucas was out. So our starting tackles was Trent Scott and Chris Paul. So that's of course not how it's going to look in the season, but something worth pointing out as well. I guess turning it over to the defensive side of things, some good, some bad, I would say. A lot to unpack. Obviously, some guys that didn't play, the big men up front, Jonathan Allen and Deron Payne, did not start. I believe Bobby Wagner, of course, didn't start as well, but I believe all the other starters were out there at the start of the game. Any initial thoughts on that first unit, guys?
I mean, yeah, any game that you lose is obviously going to be something where you possibly look to the defense and say, how do you let these points up? I wasn't necessarily angry with the defense, so to speak. We allowed some big plays here and there, and some chunk plays, especially that we just have to sort of nail down a bit more. But obviously, preseason being what it is, we might not want to give the other teams our looks and show them how we would actually play as a starting defense against these offensive sets. So maybe a little bit of gamesmanship there from Dan Quinn, certainly a guy who was brought in because of his work defensively with both the Atlanta Falcons and the Dallas Cowboys more recently. I think there was a lot of positives to pull out of this game, and obviously I think one that we have to just bring up off the top, a big game in terms of Benning Patoe, obviously, a guy who gets a lot of love from us here on this podcast, and he deserves it because he got our one sack of the game last game, and I know I was going crazy for it. I'm sure you guys were too. I mean, we were talking a little bit during the game, and so that was really, really cool to see. Obviously, the secondary still has a lot of questions to it. I think that those guys really need to figure out sort of, what is my role? What am I doing wrong? How can I improve? Guys like Emmanuel Forbes, I mean, obviously, somewhat of a legend, or maybe, not for the best reasons, a guy that we remember from this podcast, obviously from draft night. He seemed to have a bit of a rough game, and obviously we've talked about how he's had rough practices, and media's gotten on him, especially about having these sort of rough practices. So obviously that's just a guy that needs to start to improve. Otherwise, we might not see him on the team soon. And in terms of the other defensive guys, I didn't have too many notes, but I felt like this linebacker room, we didn't see our top guys out there, so it's unfair to say they played poorly, but certainly not hopeful for what happens if any of our starters, our big name starters, get injured here down the line. So I'm curious as to what you guys think.
Well, right off the bat, thank you for mentioning the Benning sack. Obviously, Commanders fans worldwide rejoiced. One of the goats of our modern time. But yeah, the elephant in the room. I was gonna bring it up if you hadn't. Um, Emmanuel Forbes. I mean, it's one of the more viral things going on with this team, and that the casual NFL fan online kind of clowns us for is one of those things. I think that you're gonna start seeing in one of those graphics. We had the coaches graphic for the longest time. Oh, did you know that all of these guys were on the 2013 Washington Redskins coaching staff? The next kind of thorn in our side is going to be, did you know that the Washington Commanders drafted Emmanuel Forbes one slot ahead of Christian Gonzalez, who many have high hopes for within the Patriots organization? And it's sad to say, but this pick, it just might not pan out. I mean, I'm really hoping for the guy. I mean, he's shown flashes. He had a play in this game where he looked good on a deep pass coverage, but then again, he also gave up the touchdown to, a Jets second stringer. And of course, the clips went viral of him at practice, you know, playing poorly. I mean, I feel bad for the guy because I'm sure he sees a lot of the negativity online. And unfortunately for him, he's just gonna have to deal with it. And I hope that he can improve. I had high hopes with Dan Quinn. I mean, the jury's still not out. A lot of season left, a lot of career left for him, but it hasn't been a great start.
Yeah, I think the issue with Forbes too, and it's not his fault in a way, is that I think he was obviously drafted high, right? And it was definitely a reach, and so he's got this expectation that he's supposed to be a really good day one starter, right? And so he's clearly not there yet. And so yes, he does continue to struggle as we saw in this game. I'm not sure what the coaching staff has in mind. We will be okay. I think if we have to plug in one of our other guys, I feel better about the secondary depth overall this year than I have in years past. But yeah, not great to see out of him. Thank you, kudos for bringing up the Benning Pota'ai comment, because I was going to also mention that where did we see that sack? Relatively early in the game, if I do recall. He was with the second team. Okay. And I'm recognizing that also Johnny Newton, now that I think about it, was out as well. He did not play in this game. But we saw the first two guys in that case was Fedarian Mathis and Benning Potahi ahead of John Ridgeway, which, garners well for him that this staff might like him over a guy like John Ridgeway. So don't be surprised if you see more of Benning Potahi. And I think he actually looked good. I mean, we do clown, but maybe this is the start of something completely legendary for the guy. Um, Other than that, again, you mentioned the linebackers. Um, I didn't see much of Jordan McGee. Apparently, he got injured early in the game, so that's kind of a bummer because I actually was excited for him about as sort of like that key linebacker depth for us. I thought guys like Michael Walker and Anthony Pittman, they were out there. I didn't see anything crazy from them. So overall, I think the room's better than last year for sure, and in years past. No more David Mayo's leading the charge, but um, I think obviously that Frankie Louvu, Bobby Wagner duo is going to be amazing. You also talk about linebackers. You talk about Jamin Davis, a guy that they really converted to coming off the edge, and so you did see that in game, and I thought he looked good. He had a few tackles, and so Jamin Davis, I think maybe this is the turning of a new leaf for him as a player. Not sure if that's the case or if it's just the only way they view him making this team. Either or, I thought he had a decent game. And in terms of other edge rushers, obviously Dorrance Armstrong, I believe he played a little bit as well and was taken out quickly alongside Cleveland Farrell, both exiting the game quickly. Dante Fowler, I don't believe even played. I'm not sure what's his deal, but yeah, what else were you guys seeing there?
I'm glad you brought up Davis. That was going to be another big talking point I wanted to discuss because obviously we drafted him to be a middle linebacker, and it's not like he was completely a horrible player either. I mean, he showed some flashes. Again, maybe not necessarily living up to the first round talent, but I don't think people were necessarily labeling him a bust per se. But it was always evident that he was a really athletic player, and that with a guy like that, you deserves to be on the field. But of course, us bringing in the high level linebackers we did, this coaching staff thought, maybe we can utilize him in another way. And I thought there was some good, but there's also some bad. I saw him fail to set the edge on a play or two, but he did have some tackles, from that spot. He's obviously a very fast player, but it's a new position for him. There's going to be some learning curves, but overall, it could work. Is he going to be a starter at that spot? I'm not sure, but I I would be interested to see them. Let's say we've got Luvu and Wagner in the middle. You bring in Davis, who could be kind of a hybrid edge kind of guy. You could put in there in run
I like
packages or
that.
even disguise him and have him drop in coverage.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't want to be mean about to Jamin Davis because I truly believe he is a talented player. He's a guy that can impact this team. And he's a really young guy. I don't want to, necessarily say anything too bad about him. But one of the things that I had as a criticism for him is that it always seemed like he was playing instinctively rather than mentally, meaning he wasn't necessarily, reading the offense and sort of seeing what was happening pre-snap and getting into position. He was reacting to the game as it came to him, and I think that's something that you see working better on the edge rather than as a middle linebacker. You kind of want the middle linebacker to be the proverbial quarterback of your defense, making adjustments and making sure that things go right. Um, as far as him on the edge, I think it's a great move, and I think that we saw that somewhat pay off, as you guys mentioned, with all those tackles on the edge. And Clark, you are absolutely right. He had some trouble making that edge, sort of secure for the defense, so that we didn't have to worry about people scrambling out to the side or the running back getting past him. But that's something that comes with the growing pains of the position. I mean, effectively for Jamin Davis, this is year one in the NFL at this position. So I'm not too mad at what I saw. I think that this is a great move. I think that this is actually somewhat of a Dan Quinn special, taking a guy who, he might not be the best guy in terms of playing coverage or sort of reading the offense, but his intangibles make him a guy that can play different positions and maybe makes him better at these different positions than he was at the original ones. So that's really my only note on Jim, and I think that he's a guy that we have to especially look towards in these next two games and see how he either develops or shows out a bit more as we go through the rest of the preseason. Now, obviously, the last thing that we do have to talk about in terms of this preseason game and somewhat of the depth chart is this special teams room. Now, obviously, Tress Way, a guy who I don't think, as far as this show goes, we will never be able to talk about all the great things about Tress Way, a guy who is an absolute leader, a guy who, made multiple Pro Bowls as a punter for this team. A guy who really just, embodies what you kind of want as a glue sort of team guy to bring people together. But it's really this kicker room that we have to talk about. We see us coming to this first game with Ramiz Ahmed, and I believe Riley Patterson is the first name of our other kicker. And you see Riley Patterson struggle with the missed field goal, and you see Ramiz Ahmed hit a 40-yarder, and you think, okay, well that's certainly a point towards Ahmed. But then you look forward to the additions and subtractions of this team following that game, and we cut Ramiz Ahmed. So, I think that's a bit interesting, and I'm wondering if that's more of a sign that Dan Quinn is trying to put more trust into Riley Patterson, and that he's thinking that these issues might be because he has himself looking over his shoulder at Ramiz Ahmed. But that's certainly something that we do have to talk about here, as this special teams room is one that we've had a lot of turnover in the kicking room. I mean, I think our last multiple year starter outside of Joey Sly might have been Kai Forbath or Dustin Hopkins. Um, so looking for a little bit of stability. I'm wondering if you guys have any notes on the special teams room. I'm not the biggest hater of Riley Patterson, just not a great showing in that first preseason game.
First off, I want to shout out Tress Way for his massive tackle on that punt return in this game. And
Hell
it
yeah.
was awesome to see, everyone on the sideline crowding around him, so hyped for the guy. I mean, just getting it done for the brand. Um, but of course he's the consummate pro. We all love Tress Way, excited to see him for the first time wearing a new number as well, which that was an awesome story of him giving the number to Jayden Daniels. But in terms of the kicking unit, I mean, Patterson is at least a guy that has NFL experience. Ahmed was playing, and I believe the UFL this past year. Performed pretty well. But Patterson, despite the missed kick, I mean, that's going to happen for your kickers, and it is a room that we've seen some inconsistency. Um, Joey Sly was by no means a world beater, but I thought he was not a bad kicker either. But of course, new coaching staff, they want to get their own players in the building. So Riley Patterson, he is a guy with NFL experience, played on the Jags. So I'm okay with it. I mean, it was interesting to see some kicking competition. Although, you know, whenever a kicker misses a field goal, you're always going to point the finger. But, I wouldn't necessarily say we need to panic that this was the decision they made.
Yeah, I also heard that maybe the concern over releasing Ramiz Ahmed was more so over kicking strength ability. Uh, I saw some reports that said the times that he was consistently missing in practice was when it was those longer kicks, those 50-yarder pluses, those 45-yarder pluses. So that's just food for thought. That could be maybe a reason as well that they're sticking with Riley Patterson. I wouldn't be surprised if another kicker is brought in before this is all said and done as well to just continue to test. This coaching staff seems like they continuously like to bring guys in and out if they're not certain about a position, as we also see with receiver. Um, Trustway also, yeah, shout out Trustway. That was nice. Kick return, punt return. I mean, obviously, we got our first look at live 2024 NFL Commanders doing the new kickoff rule and everything that comes with that. I think that's still completely wide open in terms of who's going to be the guy back there. Is that going to be Alameda Zacchaeus? Is that going to be Jamison Crowder? Is that going to be another guy on their roster in that crowded receiver room? I mentioned Davion Davis earlier. I don't think he's making the team, but that was a guy we saw out there doing that. Is it Luke McCaffrey? Who knows, right? So I think that's wide open. And then I guess just tying us out in terms of we didn't really touch on the secondary beyond Emmanuel Forbes. You saw St. Juice out there starting opposite him, who, let's see how his season goes. I mean, it seems like the staff seems to have some confidence in him, and I think that he could, he could turn some heads. I think no one's really talking about St. Juice as, he kind of flew under the radar this whole offseason given everything that's been happening. So curious to see what happens there. Obviously, Mike Sanderstill, a guy that we drafted this year, as part of that upper cohort of high draft picks that we were working with, and I thought he looked good. I mean, it was limited time, limited snaps, but he was running with the ones and seems to have locked up that kind of slot cornerback spot, so to speak, right? And then we did see a little bit of Jeremy Chin with the ones. You saw some Dominique Hampton, another guy that we drafted. You saw him more later in the game playing. I thought he looked all right. He looked pretty good. Um, we, did I can't recall if Derek Forrest was in this game or not. So correct me if any of you guys saw him or not, but not sure if he was there. I definitely know Quan Martin was starting opposite of Jeremy Chin in the
Yeah, I
first.
was going to say that is one thing to note. Derek Forrest, a guy that played very well for us in that 22 season, of course, played by injuries in
Right.
23. Not in the starting lineup. I feel like most of us pretty much assumed that it would be Chin and Forrest in the back of the secondary. But of course, Quan Martin, a guy whose family has spoken with a member of this podcast at a Commanders game, um,
That's true. That's
finds
true.
himself now potentially in a starting spot for this team.
That is true. I did meet Quan Martin's parents on my way walking up to the nosebleeds, who were also in the nosebleeds. So that was nice to see. Hopefully, the Harris family will take better care of them and things like that. But no, they were nice people, and yeah, again, I agree. I'm excited for Quan Martin. It's almost a kind of a positional change. I think they just view him as more of a true safety than the previous coaching staff had really viewed him. So hopefully that plays to his strengths, and we see a lot out of him. Would love to have a nice, young guy like that who's very talented opposite Jeremy Chin, learning from him, and also just learning from the defense in front of him. Very talented guys among that group. So overall, I'm very excited as well.
Yeah, Juan Martin is a guy who I think we all can agree was a bit of a standout in terms of the younger guys on the team last year. I'm happy to see him move to that safety position. I do think that Derek Forrest move is a bit questionable, and I think it's really just because we didn't have much film on him from last year. He is a Ron regime guy. He is a guy who played very well for us in that Ron regime. Maybe doesn't necessarily fit the defensive schemes that you would see for Dan Quinn. Quan Martin being who he is, being a little bit younger, maybe even a step or two faster, uh, possibly works a little bit better to that Duran Bland sort of, hybrid safety corner zone guy that you see in the Dan Quinn system a bit more. So I think that was really good. And yeah, I mean, if there's one room that doesn't need to be, sort of praised too much because it's been so good for many years, it's this safety room. We've always had a lot of safety depth. I agree with you guys about these guys playing very well or at least good enough in these games to really not make them, a negative. Um, so I think that's important. And you talk about change, and I think this is a perfect time to start talking about the additions and subtractions to this team. Now, obviously, we talk a bit about the Ramiz Ahmed cut and what that may have been about. But one of the guy who I think, close to my heart, certainly, and maybe the fans of this podcast as well, is Dax Milne. Obviously, is released by the Commanders at the same time as Byron Pringle. Pringle would later go on to be added back to this receiver room and see Martavis Bryant join him as we learned today. So I think, those three guys are really the biggest additions and subtractions we have to talk about. And I'll start with Dax Milne. I mean, you know, a character guy, a guy who came out with Zach Wilson from that BYU team. Um, he was never really a highlight playmaker per se, but he always seemed to get into the fans' hearts at just the right time and did a lot of kick returning for us, something that we saw Zacchaeus and Damian Davis do a bit more this game. It's hard to see a guy like that walk out the door. It's hard for me to believe that he won't be on another NFL team. And as we talk, I do believe he was claimed by possibly the Raiders. So a guy
Yeah,
that's going to
I think so.
be, yeah, the Raiders. So a guy that's going to be, hopefully making a name for himself on another team. I wish all the best for the guy. Um, and Byron Pringle, that's just an interesting situation in itself. And I think maybe I'll save that for you guys to talk about a bit more. But it's very rare that you see a cut later turned into a re-sign situation within the matter of maybe even just a few days, if not a week. Um, so that's interesting. Martavis Bryant, there's a Pandora's box of things to talk about with this guy. Obviously bounced around a little bit in more recent times, but a name that I think maybe some fans of this podcast and also people who are just aware of the NFL would be surprised to hear is on a roster in 2024. A guy that had a lot of high hopes with the Steelers, possibly back even a decade ago at this point. So, I'm just curious what you guys think about those three, additions, subtractions, as those were arguably outside of, the guys we've already talked about, some of the biggest additions and subtractions to this team.
Yeah, definitely since our last podcast episode, those would be some of the biggest transactions that have gone down. And for Martavis Bryant, he was a guy that I believe had some issues with substances back in the day. He was out of football from 2018. He played for the Raiders and then didn't play again until 2021 in the CFL. And he was a member of the Dallas Cowboys practice squad this past year, but has not played in the NFL in an NFL game since 2018. So it's really curious his signing in this exact moment. How much does he have left in the tank? He's 32 years old. And, what are they really looking to bring him in? I mean, are some of these UDFAs we have, they don't like what they're seeing. They want to bring in a more veteran guy. Pringle, of course, maybe a fan favorite, one of the great names of all time. We thought was more of a enemy guy, but is still hanging around with this team. Not much to really say about him, but Dax Milne, my condolences, Tom. Of course, Dax Milne, one of the all-time guys. You can't write the story of the Going Commando podcast without Dax Milne. So, his presence will certainly be missed on Sundays and every time we get together to record an episode.
I'm sorry for your loss, Tom.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's a hard thing to see Dax Milne walk out the door like that. I think he had a lot to offer this team, and still had a lot to offer this team at the time that they cut him. I'm hoping that you see that sort of payoff happen with the Raiders. But Clark, you do bring up a good point with Martavis Bryant. I mean, he's played very sparingly since 2018. He's obviously, as you mentioned, he was with the Cowboys last year. Now, how much that helps or hurts his case to make the roster this year on the Commanders, who's to say? Um, Obviously, the substance issues were the big thing that kept him out of the league for these past 6 years. And as you know, the league's stance has softened on these issues with time. So has sort of our thoughts about the players who may have been, running against the brick wall, so to speak, in 2018 and sort of the earlier years of this, sort of more not necessarily controversial, but certainly important discussion topics within the NFL. Um, Byron Pringle, I mean, Clark, you hit the nail on the head. There's not much to talk about with this guy. Absolutely legendary name. Surprised we haven't seen a Pringles sponsorship with him yet, although maybe there was one specifically in the Kansas City area regions following those Super Bowls in his run with that team. But I think it's interesting that you see a guy subtracted from the team, then added back. Maybe that's just a contract play. Maybe they wanted to sort of, show him, hey, listen, these other teams aren't going to be paying you much more than we're going to be offering you if they do. And if they do pay you more, they might, it's going to be a worse team that you might not want to go to. So I'm happy to see him back. Martavis Bryant, though, I want to see him play in a preseason game. And it's not because he has something to offer, but more to see what he actually has, because it's a big question mark at this point what this guy is. But yeah, there was certainly a hole in my heart the day that I saw Dax Milne cut from the team, and when I saw Byron Pringle re-signed, I got a little bit hopeful for a minute that Dax Milne would be coming back too on some sort of better contract. But it seems like this is going to be a permanent one, and it's a big loss for this podcast, yes, but for us as Commanders fans to not see a guy like that really blossom into the NFL wideout that I think we all believe that he could have been for this team.
Man, I don't even know what to say. I'm so devastated over the last loss of Dax Milne. But I think we will go on as best we can, anyways. In terms of Martavis Bryant, I think uh, that's just a camp guy. I mean, I don't think he's actually going to make the team. I think actually what he really is more so a guy they might want to just put on their practice squad as just yet another veteran guy for their young guys to kind of be around. Also, he's a taller receiver. I feel like our team kind of lacks size at the receiver position. And so I think that just gives the defense a different look in practice, is having a guy like that. You don't have Cam Sims anymore, so we need to go out and get another tall kind of receiver like a Martavis Bryant. So, just comping him to Cam Sims. I know he's not as good, but hey, um, Byron Pringle, that's another guy I think they're just toying around with at the kick returner, punt returner slot. And I think that's why he was brought back, because he's got some experience there. And I think they're just toying around with that. Again, I don't know if he's a guy that really has a spot here. I don't think he's a bad player by any means. I think he's a guy that can kind of fill some receiver depth on a lot of teams in the league. But I don't know if again, he's not a guy that this staff brought in or is attached to. And he's kind of on the inside looking out at this point. So I think unless he wows the staff in terms of his kick return, punt return abilities, then I don't know if he makes this team. Would be happy to keep him around though in a practice squad capacity, of course.
I think that is some great notes about the additions and subtractions of this team. Obviously, a big shout out to Dax Milne, and let this be known as the Dax Milne eulogy podcast. If we're assigning names to these things, but I think with that sort of lowering of the mood, let's try and bring it up a little bit here. Let's talk about these next two preseason games. we have some big matchups on the way, and these are going to be very important games for us, as you'll see more and more of this first team offense, hopefully playing against the first team defenses in the league. Obviously, the next game being this Saturday, 7 p.m. versus the Dolphins. I believe that will be at Hard Rock Stadium. A tough team to play against. Obviously, a lot of star power on the other side of that field. Interesting to see who will actually play in the second preseason game. A lot of guys that they probably don't want to risk the injury for, but you still need to get a look out of. And then wrapping up the preseason against the Patriots at home, obviously one that we will all be looking towards, as that is probably our best chance to see the most of this first team offense, and see a guy like Drake May, someone who was mocked in a lot of mock drafts to come to this Commanders team, play against us at home, and Jayden Daniels being on the field hopefully as well, barring any sort of changes in coaching or whatever. So I'm sort of curious, and I'll frame this question this way: what is something that you guys are looking forward to in these next two games, and then what is your sort of your hope or expectation or spotlight for a specific player as we look forward to these games? And I'll sort of I'll kick this one off here. These next two preseason games, it will be the same thing that I'm looking forward to in both of them, which is how does this offense run? We saw this team go to more of a run heavy offense, use that to open up the pass and sort of, move the ball down the field. I think that is a great way to play. That's the way that I was taught to play, from coaching, and it's a style that I really do love to see, especially when you have a dynamic backfield like Eckler and Robinson, and you have a mobile quarterback who can also throw like Jayden Daniels. So I think what I'm specifically looking forward to is how does this offense flow? What is the way that we get through a 3rd and 3? How do we approach maybe a 2nd and 10 where that first play doesn't work? You can't necessarily get that from the first preseason game, and I think that's going to be a really important thing for fans to look forward to, because I think that this could be a really good showing of how this offense is going to find, its spark and really get that motor running as we enter into the regular season. And for a specific player, this might come a bit out of left field, but, Jahan Dotson, as we mentioned earlier, he needs to show us that he can be that proven number 2 guy, especially in a wide receiver room where we're questioning who number 3 is. So he needs to show us that he can be that number 2 guy. And my expectations for him is that he has to at least double his catches across these next 2 games, really show us some more with the yardage, and I'm hoping that he can prove to be that versatile receiver out of the slot that we hope he is. And maybe, sneaky, this could also be on De'Ami Brown a bit to be that guy, to show that he can be the guy opposite of Terry McLaurin on the outside of the field. So I'm hoping, those are the 2 guys that I would specifically point a spotlight to if I could. But I'm curious what you guys are looking forward to, and who's someone or some players that you want to put a spotlight on for these next 2 games.
Yeah, for me, again, obviously, the more we can see Jayden Daniels play, the better. I know with that being said, don't play him too much because we want to have him ready for the regular season, barring anything that would happen. But it was an exciting first drive. I'd love to see him play, some more over the next couple of games. Um, and with that being said, the other starters, like I mentioned earlier, Brandon Coleman, I really, really hope he can get healthy, and I hope that he can get some snaps with the first team, because that is something I certainly have my eye on, as well as hopefully the rest of those tackles, with Cosme at guard and Wiley as well. Hopefully they can all get at least a series or two together, um, to generate a little bit of chemistry before the season begins. I'm very interested to see how the kind of third wide receiver develops. Is it going to be Olamide Zaccheaus? Will we see Luke McCaffrey, emerge? Is it going to be a new signing? What's going to happen with our back end depth with our wide receivers? And then on the defensive side of things, um, again, I just want to see the unit kind of have a go. Obviously, our linebackers are going to be very experienced now. And, Wagner is nearing the end of his career, so we shouldn't really throw him into the fire in the preseason. But I'm excited to get to see him in a Washington Commanders uniform. And another guy that we didn't really talk about that much, but I thought played well in the first preseason game in his snaps was Mike Sanderstill. And a lot of people believe that he could be a premier slot cornerback in this league in only his first year. And I'm excited to see what he could bring. And not to mention, I hope that we can see Jerzon Newton potentially suit up in the preseason, as many thought that he was first round talent, and he's overcoming that foot injury. Hopefully, we get to see some snaps out of him.
All excellent points, Clark. And I think that the O line, like you mentioned, that I want to see that develop some more. I'd like to see some more continuity there. I know they like playing around in this time during the preseason with guys at spots. So I think you actually will continue to see a lot of that shuffling. But would like to see again some continuity there, at least with the ones, get them some experience together. Whoever that ends up being, if everyone is healthy, right? Definitely a lot of competition at receiver room. There's some competition really for RB3 as well, as we mentioned earlier. Won't harp too much on that, but again, can a guy like Mike Wally, break this roster because he's more dynamic potentially, or is it really Jeremy McNichols, a journeyman guy that has connections to Peters that they feel can run and also catch? So who will that be, right? C-Rod obviously in that mix as well. Who in terms of quarterback, I think it's pretty clear that Mariota is making this team as the number two. But do they keep two guys? Do they keep three? Who's their practice squad quarterback if they only keep two? So there's a lot of questions there. I think we'll probably get some more clarity, especially at quarterback. With that third potential spot as we go further here. And so, a little curious to see what happens there on the defensive side. Yeah, I think just would like to see more from the secondary. Would like to see them get tested a bit more. And obviously not sure if we're going to have any of our full bona fide starting D line, interior, or linebacking core on the field. But again, just, hope everyone plays well, stay healthy. I think that's the main thing I'm hoping for as well, is staying healthy down the stretch here ahead of the season so we can go in full force. I just continue to look forward to the team just seeming to gel well together. It seems like the guys overall really like each other, and seems like the culture that Dan Quinn is building here, as cliche as it sounds sometimes, is actually damn good. And so I would say that I'm excited more than anything, and really just looking forward to the growth potentially for these guys these next couple of games.
So that about sums up our discussion of the first preseason game, a little bit of the depth chart, some additions and subtractions, and our thoughts heading into the final two games of this preseason. So we hope you all enjoyed this episode. Before we close up shop, I believe Chris has a trivia question to pose to me and Tom.
Yeah, we like something light at the end. So curious if you guys are able to name every franchise starting quarterback, and I thought this was timely considering we're starting yet another quarterback for the first time this season. So that just adds to the laundry list. Hopefully, it plugs up the list for a while and for the foreseeable future. But can you name all the franchise quarterbacks or quarterbacks that have played for this team that have had more than 25 starts? And there's a limited number, 15. That's pretty even. 15 exactly. So
All time. This is all
all
time.
time. This is all time. This is all
But
time. And I will
I
keep
mean,
track for you.
obviously, then if we're doing all time, I'll get one of the harder, older ones out of the way. Slinging Sammy Baugh, obviously a legend of this team,
Correct.
had to have started more than 25 games. Um, The other two that I'll throw out here really quick before I let Clark take a few swings here is obviously RG3 has to be on that list.
Correct.
As well as Kirk Cousins on that list, the guy who, we've famously quoted as saying is the best quarterback we've seen in our lifetime. So Clark, I'll let you take a few stabs at this because I got to think this over a little bit.
Those three are correct.
I'm going to go Sonny Jurgensen.
Correct.
I'm going to follow that up with Billy Kilmer.
That is correct.
And if we keep this thing rolling, Joe Theismann, obviously.
Yep. Obviously, Joe Theismann has the most starts out of any quarterback ever for our franchise, 124.
And then after him, it gets tricky because the two other Super Bowl winning quarterbacks, I'm not even confident have 25 total starts for us. I don't think that Doug Williams would be on there. And Mark Rippon, he had that great season that led us to the Super Bowl, but how many? I guess there's 16 games in a season. I guess I would say I don't think Williams is on this, but I think you'll see Mark Rippon.
Mark Rippon is on this list. Correct. And Doug Williams is not on this list. So both of those assumptions / guesses are correct.
So how many do we have left at this point in time? Because I have a few names
Let's see.
percolating. However, I'm not too sure.
Let's see how many you have left. Hold on. 8 left. You've gotten 7 so far. You have 8 left.
Give me Jason Campbell.
Correct.
I'll take the next swing with Rex Grossman, possibly.
Nope.
I'm going to say no on that one.
Rex is not on this list. Rex
Brunel.
had 16 starts. Brunel is correct. Brunel had 33 starts.
Can I say a Brad Johnson?
You can with 27 starts. Just makes the cut.
Just getting in there. Man.
This is the
90s.
of it.
Who else is 90s?
Well, Scab quarterback only played about 4 games. There's really not much else. I mean, we drafted Heath Schuler. I don't think he would have made it to 25 games on this team. Is it possible? And this is a big swing here, but if I get this, I will be quite excited. Is it possible Colt McCoy might have reached that number?
That is not possible, unfortunately.
I was going to say, I'll kind of go in that same vein and see if Taylor Heineke got there.
Not quite. Taylor Heineke, I believe, had 24 starts, so he was 1 shy from making this list.
He should have gotten that start against the Browns. That should have put him there.
Woulda.
And then I think another guy who I think he has to have possibly made it on here. Did Gus Frerotte make it?
Correct. 46 starts. That's another one. So now let's see. You guys have 4 left. You've got 11.
Is Patrick Ramsey one of those names?
No, and I thought he would be too. Patrick Ramsey also only 24 starts alongside Taylor Heineke.
Oh, of course we have to go back to the I believe mid to late 80s for this guy, but did Jay Schrader
make
it on this list?
Correct.
Good one.
That's a good one. That's a good one. So yes, that is correct. Now you only have 3 left. And I'll admit these 3 are some of the more difficult ones.
There's one I have in mind. He was a 5'7" quarterback that played for us in the 1950s. His name is evading me at this moment in time.
5 foot. Would it be? Are you thinking of LeBron, aka Eddie LeBaron?
Eddie LeBaron. Eddie LeBaron.
I was gonna say that is a good guess because he was 5'7", and yes, he had 57 starts. That's a lot.
Yes.
That's more than that's the same number as Cousins.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
I believe the only other one I might be able to add to this, as I know that this is a guy that almost did the Art Shell and started in 3 different decades. But did Norm Snead make it?
Yes.
Obviously a journeyman quarterback in the 60s and 70s. I say obviously as if it is so, but a guy that I know was the closest in terms of making it into 3 different decades as a starter. So
Norm Snead with 42 starts.
and then you might have gotten me on this last one.
I'm not sure. I think the tank might be emptying for me. Yeah, I have to assume that this is like another 50s like era guy. And to be honest with you, LeBaron was the only kind of guy I may have been familiar with from that time.
Any final guesses? You got 14 for 15 here.
I, I have no clue. Why don't you give it to us, Chris? What do you got?
I wouldn't have gotten this either. A man by the name of Frank Filchock. In
Frank
the
Yeah.
Filchock.
late 30s and 40s, Frank Filchock was drafted to be Sammy Baugh's replacement, and Washington would often rotate Baugh and Filchock out by the quarter. He had some success leading the league in touchdowns twice. Okay. Before losing 2 of his prime seasons due to serving in the Navy during World War II. Still not on Baugh's level, however. That's the excerpt on him. So apparently he was pretty solid.
I mean,
Well,
who could forget?
Who could forget
obviously,
old Frank, man? Frank and Sammy, they were boys.
in salute to his service, God, Eddie Filchock.
Frank, but yeah,
Pardon me, Frank
Yeah.
Filchock, obviously making an impact on
can't
and
forget
off the
Frank.
field.
Yeah, so and like I mentioned, a close second. A close, just barely missing the cut. Taylor Heineke and Patrick Ramsey at 24, and also a man by the name of Harry Gilmer, also 24 starts. Sam Howell with 18. A couple notables here. Rex Grossman, 16. Alex Smith, 16. Doug Williams, 14. Our beloved Doug, only with 14. Heath Schuler with 13. McNabb with 13. The late
Alex
Dwayne
Smith should have
Haskins with
should have
13.
had more, man. Alex Smith should have been on that list.
How many did Carson Wentz start for us?
Too many.
Too many.
4,
7 too many.
7. Oh,
That's the same as Colt McCoy. Wish we got a couple more out of him, honestly.
should have. If this was games played, maybe he makes this
Yeah,
list.
Colt should get some honorary starts for his years of service to our franchise.
Absolutely.
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quarterbacks in the history of our franchise that have had only one start.
We are certainly
That's
not going
another
to
good
try to
stat.
name that.
That's another weird stat. Unfortunately, I could name 3 of them right off the bat even before I saw this list. But
I
the others
maybe
very
Josh
long time
Johnson
ago.
and Mark Sanchez are the
Josh
top.
No,
Johnson
Johnson
was the
started
big one.
multiple games. He started multiple games.
Oh,
Oh shoot. Anyways,
Can't have started multiple games. We'll save that one for another time.
absolutely.
absolutely.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great trivia. And with that being said, we hope y'all enjoyed today's show. A little bit of trivia to spice it up at the end. That was a great trivia brought to us by our co-host Chris. But for my other co-host Tom, and of course Chris, my name is Clark, and we'll catch y'all next time after our next couple of preseason games ahead of the regular season and our opener at Tampa Bay. And as always, HTTR and HTTC.